Alright, so this project file we have here, to start off with, we're at 89 BPM, which is important to note because, like, a lot of old school hip hop, like, more like East Coast type stuff, or just generally like stuff from the 90s, that Knxwledge is trying to sound like, or is influenced by, is typically around like 92 to 95 BPM, or like 90, I guess. But this stuff tends to be a little bit slower and more laid back. So I went for 89 BPM. And yeah, like anything around like 85, 89, 90. It's all small differences, but it makes a big difference in the end. So anyway, to start off with, we just have these drums. And so the way I made these is I just took a few samples and put them together. To start off with, the kick is 2 layers. It is this layer, and then this layer. And so I just have one that's the low end and one that's the high end, basically. Like this one, you can see I filtered out all the high end, and then this one I filtered out the low end. And then I just have a little cut around here because there were some nasty frequencies. But this is a pretty good technique to make your own drums. It's been talked about a lot. You may have heard about it before. But it's a really good way to do it because you can take something you like about one sample and something you like about another sample and put them together and make one. And if you're good at leveling them out right, like you see here, I have these turned down a bunch, and then also the kick is turned down, and then also here it's turned down. These 2 levels are just to get these, like, the right balance between each one, basically. But it's good. You can make your own drums. And the reason why I did it was because I heard a lot of his kicks that he tends to use are, like, kind of boomy around, like, the 100 to 200 hertz range, maybe a little bit higher, like 300. And so I wanted to sort of get something that sounded like that. But then they also have a bit of high end that's sort of subdued, like very similar to this kick, where it's like not like obviously super high end, but it's not super it's not like nothing either. It's just very sort of mellow, I guess, and not like super hard hitting. Now for the snare, there's not much going on. I just pitched this one snare sample down, -3, I guess. And then I put this little EQ on it. You can hear it's very subtle, but it's just taking out a little bit of the high end because, like I was saying, we're going for this sort of like mellow, lo-fi type of vibe with this. And so with this snare, the high end just didn't really feel very authentic to that for me, so I cut out a little bit of it. Now the hi-hat, I didn't really do much with. I just kind of took this sample and used it. It's a pretty good hi-hat sample. But this is where I want to talk about the programming, because as you can see, this is like very off of the beat. So essentially what I did with the hi-hat was I started with like 16th notes. I'll make a new track. So I started, like I took this and just made a 16th note pattern like this, where it just goes like this. And then what I did was I just moved it off of the grid. So Ableton, you have this like adaptive grid here. If you select, like I usually keep it on narrow. And what you can do is you see as I zoom in, it gets smaller and smaller. So I just zoomed in a bunch and then move this forward. And if you zoom in enough, I think it'll just turn off it'll just turn the grid off. And basically I just move that forward. You can do the same thing with the track delay here, and I actually did that with the sample. I'll show you in a second. But I wanted this to be more visual, like I wanted to see exactly where it was, so that's why I did it on here. And yeah, so that it makes it sit over top of the groove a lot better when you move the hi-hat forward like that. That's a technique I hear a lot, because like if I do it versus like this, you can hear when I moved it forward, it just sort of feels more like human and raw. And I did that with pretty much everything. I took almost everything off of the grid as far as drums are concerned. The snare's a little before the beat. The kick. The only kicks that are on the beat are the ones on 1 and 3 because those sort of anchor it. And you could even take those off the grid. And I've heard songs where Knxwledge has done that, but for this purpose, I wanted to just keep it on the beat. Now the only other thing there is I put on the group, I put a bit warmer, the saturator preset. You can see it just sort of fattens everything up and glues everything together nicely. And gives it a little bit more like high harmonic content, aka warmth. So after that, I have this vinyl noise, which I just took from some pack that had a bunch of them. And you can see I just looped this one part because the rest of the sample was kind of like noisy. And you can sort of hear, you don't want this to sound like it's a loop because you want it to be, like you want it to sound like you're really listening to a record where there's like vinyl noise, you know? And that isn't just like a perfect loop. It obviously changes every time based on the dust on the record and stuff. But once you get everything going with it, it's a little harder to hear that it's a loop, so I didn't really sweat that too much. And all I did with that was I just converted it to mono, because the original sample just had like a little bit of weird stereo field stuff. I think it was a little out of phase. I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, and that just sort of goes with the whole theme of like, you're trying to make this sound kind of like dirty and lo-fi. And Knxwledge also, I know he uses an MPC, and he samples from records. But I'm using Ableton, and I'm sampling from YouTube. So you have to do a few things to sort of compensate for that. And that's like putting the saturator on the drums and like that little low-pass filter I put on the snare. Stuff like that is like small details that add to the big picture. It's like I was saying, I think in my last video, it's like, you want to think about this like a painting where like, you're making, like in a painting, the very small details all come together to make the big picture. And that's what we're doing here. So I'm going to stop talking about that and talk about the sample now. So as far as the sample goes, I'll show you what I started with. So I started with this. It's like a sample from some old record that I found on YouTube. I think Knxwledge has sampled this before. So, pretty cool. And you can hear there's already a lot of texture in that sound, which is important. Obviously, we want our sounds to have like a lot of texture in this, like I was saying, like the lo-fi, dirty, rough around the edges feel. So the key is, yeah, like you want to use like older samples because they'll have that texture, and you won't have to do as much to it. It's better to magnify. Like, it's better to start with something that has that texture and sort of be magnifying it, as opposed to starting with something that doesn't have that and having to create it. You'd be much better off just trying to magnify it, like I said. I think that's like a pretty good way to describe it, and I think that's what like Knxwledge does very well. So as far as the sample goes, all I did was I pitched it down, just sort of, because I made it slower, and that's what happens. Like if I unwarp this, I'll show you. So you have like the starting thing. If I slow it down, or if I pitch it down, it gets slower. So that's sort of the key there. And then I quantized some of the notes, or some of the hits, mostly just the quarter notes and a few of the 16 notes, because with these older like record samples, a lot of times, even if you have it like synced to the beat, like I have this as a perfect 4-bar loop that matches the tempo, you can still, some of the percussion and stuff gets kind of weird because they were never really like recording the click tracks and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to make sure to get that all right. Now other than that, I just processed it. I put this EQ on it, which has a high pass filter, essentially, just cutting out the low end to make room for the bass. And then I cut out some of the high end because it sounded a little too like it didn't sound lo-fi enough, like I said, with that high end on there. So I just cut that out. Then I put a bit warmer on there, just to make it a bit warmer. You can see that really brings out like the saturated sound, I guess. Now I have it sidechained to the kick. I think I have to solo the kick. Yeah. And what that just does is, so a lot of times, like I hear in Knxwledge tracks, he uses, it sounds like the whole thing is very compressed. Now, not in a bad way, because a lot of compression can be very bad and it can be very good. His sounds pretty good. But a lot of times, yeah, it sounds like the whole thing is like very compressed and sort of like being very like squashed. And what that causes is the drums start to, or the samples and like, you know, more like melodic stuff tends to get sort of ducked out of the way by the drums. So I wanted to create that, but maybe have it be a bit more controlled, because like if I just put a compressor on the master, it's not gonna sound too good probably. So that's what this side chaining does. It makes it sound like that, but it's not like too out of control. Now before I go to the bass line, I want to show you on the bass line and the sample, I track delayed them. And the way you get that is you just press this D down here, and then you can move it forward like however many milliseconds you want. Move it back as you see the values. Now, this is literally the same thing as I did with the hi-hats where I moved them forward. You can do it, I can do the same thing, I can do the same thing this way by just moving it forward in the arrangement. But doing it with the track delay actually helps with something like this, because you can just sort of make it, it's like more fluid to move it around this way, for me at least. Now, I'll show you why I did that, because it tends to like help the groove a lot when you do it. If I take it off, it sounds alright, but this really makes it feel like, you see it's a little bit off now, and especially in the bass line, grooving with the drums, that's important. So yeah, it's just a little detail that I like to mess around with. But you can actually try that a lot of times, like if you have percussion or if you have a sample or a bass line that isn't sounding right. If you put some track delay on it, 50 is a bit high, 50 milliseconds. Usually I'd start with maybe like 20 to 30. But yeah, if you use that, you can actually get a lot of cool sort of groove out of your samples. And a lot of times you can actually find that they will work a little bit better if you do that. So now for the bass line, what I did was I took the sample loop. I literally just duplicated this track, but I filtered out all the high end. So I'll show you. If I take this, you can hear it's just the sample. But if you put this on, there's not that much going on in the low end besides the bass. So I basically just isolated the bass line from the original. And that's really like one of the best ways to do it, because keeping it on audio like this keeps it like I said, like you're using like these very textured kind of like raw sounds. Whereas even if I made this exact same notes with like a synth bass, for example, or just like a sub, or even like a contact instrument of like a bass, bass guitar, it just wouldn't have that same kind of texture and feel that you get from just using a sample. So I wanted to do that. And like I said, it yeah, just kind of keeps it with the vibe that everything else is going with. So there's not really too much to that. I just sort of filtered it down, and then I have a bit warmer on it, and then I sidechain this to the kick as well, which is pretty important with the bass line, because you want the kick and the bass line, and really the drums and the bass line, to work together. That's sort of the foundation of all this. Similar to like what I say a lot with like house music, where like the kick and the bass line and the drums are really like the foundation, and then you want to put everything on top of that. That's really important here, because it's very groove based in that same way. So you see, like we have these working. Now we can put on the sample, and it all just sort of fits. So there's not too much to that, but definitely that bassline technique is an important one, and it's definitely something that was used a lot in like I was saying, more like old school stuff that sort of informs this style. A lot of times people would just do that, or like they'd be sampling, they'd take like a drum loop and filter that down and make a bass line out of it. There's a lot of things you can use, but it's a good one to do, and definitely a good way to sort of, like I said, get a more textured bass line that doesn't just sound like all in the box and has more of that sort of rough, like authentic feel. Now another thing I want to touch on, I couldn't really put in this project file because I wanted to avoid copyright, but I'll show quickly in this. So basically something else he does a lot is he uses like acapellas from like different songs, I guess. They're not always old school hip hop, but a lot of times they are. But like he did like that Meek Mill remix thing, and he has like a famous one with Danny Brown, I know. And just generally, like a lot of times, even if he isn't using a full acapella of a song, he will take like little pieces of it. Like I'll show you in this. You hear he's got that little like yeah sample or whatever. And I couldn't really do that in here again for copyright, but you can do that pretty easily if you just find like old like Wu-Tang Clan acapellas or like Slum Village acapellas or like I don't know Mobb Deep, like stuff like that, just kind of like older hip hop. A lot of times, you know, before they would start like their verse or the hook or whatever, they'd have like a little intro where they're talking, or they'd just be sort of like grooving and be saying like yeah, like all kinds of stuff. And you can put those in here, and if you put them like rhythmically with the beat, you can make some cool stuff like that. And it sounds like he's got a little delay on there as well. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, there's not really too much to it. It's just sort of, it's more a matter of like finding samples and getting the vibe right. And really, the key to finding samples is you just want to find like find the stuff that like the people you want to sound like have sampled, right? Like say find like what Knxwledge has sampled, and then look at other music by those artists and other music that are on the labels that those came out on, and other music even like from the same year and same genre as that music. And you'll find stuff pretty quickly. There's definitely like, it's not too hard to find good samples, honestly, if you just know where to look. And also you can check, like YouTube has a lot of good playlists, like a lot of people have made like dope sample playlists. You know, stuff like that is really good to work from. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I want to say the samples and this project file are in the description. You can just download them for free, as well as my Bandcamp is in the description, which has a few sample packs. They're all just $5. You can get those. The Future Beats one especially would be pretty good for this, and it's got definitely some good drum samples and some good like sample loops that you could use if you wanted to make beats like this. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for all the support. Please like and share and subscribe to me, and comment on this video if you liked it. I hope you have a great day, and thank you so much.